Hello, welcome to my presentation of the adaptation of The Girl on the Train from a book to the big screen. So, introduction. This PowerPoint presentation will look at multiple different perspectives surrounding the book and the film versions of The Girl on the Train. This will include an evaluation of the different techniques used, an evaluation of a storyboard, an analysis and evaluation of the translation between the book and the film versions, an analysis and evaluation of the key differences between the book and the film. As well as this, conclusions will be made and references lists will be provided. So, evaluation of the different techniques used. To some extent, the three-act story structure is an effective technique when writing a screenplay. This is evident within The Girl on the Train, as the three-act story structure of a beginning, middle, and end provides the screenwriter with the means to keep the audience engaged with the narrative. This is as this layout allowed the screenwriter Aaron Cressida Wilson to develop an in-depth exposition as the audience is introduced to Rachel, who has recently divorced and frequently commutes from the suburbs to New York City by train, on which she follows a fascination into other people's lives by observing her ex-husband Tom and his new wife Anna, as well as their neighbours Scott and Megan Hipwell. Furthermore, there is even more depth to the exposition, as during this time it is also made clear how Rachel's mental state is unfit, as she is shamefully drinking vodka on the train. Her shame is insinuated by after a disapproving reaction from a fellow passenger, as she then chooses to change from openly drinking from the bottle to instead drinking the vodka discreetly from a water bottle. This therefore shows how the three-act story structure can utilise the first act and exposition to create depth in the form of introducing the audience to the setting and the characters, as well as introducing key aspects that will form part of the plot. Adding to this, the first act concludes with Rachel witnessing Megan kissing an unknown man, to which Rachel, furious at his infidelity, goes to drunkenly confront Megan later on. Rachel then blacks out and awakens to a head injury and news that Megan is missing. This will have built suspense, allowing the audience to get engaged in the narrative as they will be left wondering what happened. The first act therefore kicks off the story by leaving the audience asking questions like, why did Tom and Rachel divorce? Why is Rachel so fascinated with Megan? And what happened during Rachel's blackout? These enigmas and the key mystery of Megan's disappearance and Rachel's potential involvement essentially created suspense for the audience, as now they would be eager to view the second act of the film. Therefore, to some extent, the three-act story structure is an effective technique when writing a screenplay, as The Girl on the Train suggests how the story can be built upon the first act by keeping the audience engaged. However, to some extent, a limitation to oppose the effectiveness of the three-act story structure when writing a screenplay is that the first act has to be of good quality or it will ruin the rest of the film. This is as if the first act leaves questions for the audience that are too obvious or the answers are revealed too early. The audience will not be so engaged and may stop watching the film. An example of this being if Tom is revealed to be more evil than he seems was revealed too early on, some audience members may have interpreted too early that he was the killer, which may cause them to stop watching. As well as this, if the screenwriter makes no real effort to utilise the first act by not effectively introducing the audience to some of the key characters and the world that they are in, there will be a lack of depth which will leave audience members uninterested in any occurrences that may affect these characters later on. Therefore, in order for the three-act story structure to be effective in engaging the audience, it must be done correctly right from the get-go. Separately from this, in the case of written texts, to some extent imagery is an effective technique. This is evident within the Paula Hawkins novel The Girl on the Train, as the protagonist Rachel says there are familiar faces on these trains, people I see every week going to and fro. I've recognised them and they probably recognise me. I don't know whether they see me though for what I really am. This use of imagery reflects Rachel's depressing mental state, as words such as probably and I don't know make it clear to the reader that she is very anxious and self-conscious. Furthermore, she talks about these people and questions whether or not they perceive her as she truly is. This connotes that Rachel has a negative self-image and is often worried about what others think of her. Therefore, imagery may be an effective technique to use when writing a book, as in this case it is made clear how it is possible to use it to reflect certain connotations that help the reader to gain an understanding of the internal thoughts of characters. However, to some extent, imagery may not always be a particularly effective technique, This can be suggested from the quote. There's something comforting about the sight of strangers at home. This is as this case of imagery may actually mislead the audience into believing that those people that Rachel spends time watching live happy and peaceful home lives, when in actual fact things are not as they seem, as Tom is having an affair with Megan and Megan is refusing to have a baby with Scott. Therefore, behind closed doors, all is not as good as it seems. Furthermore, Rachel was most likely drunk when she says this, which would suggest that her perception is jaded. Therefore, imagery may not have been effectively used here, as the character of which who spoke with imagery may not be a trustworthy individual for the audience to align their thoughts with. In conclusion, imagery can be effectively used when writing a book and has been effectively used in The Girl on the Train. This is as it is proven to provide connotations that help the reader to gain a more in-depth understanding of the character's mental state. Furthermore, the three-act story structure is an effective technique when writing a screenplay and has been effectively used in The Girl on the Train, as it allows the writer to create suspense and introduce enigmas right from the get-go, which will keep the audience engaged to keep watching and intrigued to find out more. However, this technique must be carefully used right from the first act, as if too much is given away too soon, the audience will become disengaged. The screenwriter of The Girl on the Train will have known this, as the pacing was effective enough to keep the enigmas going for just the right amount of time. Therefore, both techniques are effectively used in their respective separate formats. Alright. So my storyboard, we got the first shot is Rachel in the present returning back to the tunnel. Rachel suddenly realising what happened in the past when she blacked out. A silhouette of Tom walking through the tunnel, a close-up of Tom attacking Rachel, a silhouette of Tom fleeing the scene, and then two teenagers taunting Rachel. So, evaluation of the storyboard. This storyboard shows the scene in which Rachel goes back to the tunnel and has a flashback which reveals what actually happened when Rachel blacked out in the tunnel, as this is an integral part of the narrative. The first shot shows Rachel entering the dark tunnel, of which has been shaded to indicate the dark use of lighting. To some extent, this would be an effective use of lighting, as by having Rachel walk through the darkness, it would symbolise how she was going to find out previously unknown answers, as darkness can be used to symbolise the unknown due to its nature, causing poor visibility. However, to some extent, this may not be an effective use. Sorry, I should try and look at the time. Yeah, we could. May not be an effective use of lighting, as it would be interpreted that if Rachel were to be heading towards the light at the end of the tunnel, that itself would be more symbolistic of her finding answers, as a light may symbolise that truth is within her reach. The fourth shot is a close-up that shows Tom about to strike Rachel. To some extent, this type of shot would be effective, as it provides the audience with the ability to have a detailed view of Tom and his expressions. This is particularly crucial, as Tom was previously presented as calm and respectable, and due to this shot being used at this particular point, the audience would be clearly exposed to the real nastiness of Tom, as his facial expressions would expose his true self. However, to some extent, it is not just the close-up shot that may be effective in revealing Tom's true self here, but also the low angle of which the audience can see Tom from. This is as the angle places Tom in a higher position than the camera, which therefore presents him in a superior standing position, of which reflects how as a part of his bitter and twisted persona, he may see himself as superior and others as inferior to him. In conclusion, dark lighting would be effectively used in the first shot as opposed to using bright lighting, as a bright light at the end of the tunnel may unfavourably indicate that it is the end of the film, when in fact that is not the case. Furthermore, with the focus being more on dark lighting throughout the tunnel, this would effectively connote how Rachel is exploring the unknown in an effort to find answers. Furthermore, both the close-up shot and low angle are effectively used in the fourth shot, as they both help to reveal to the audience Tom's true evil self by displaying certain facial expressions that connote negative behaviour, such as his devious grin and an ill-intentioned look in his eyes. The low-angled shot also helps display to the audience how Tom wishes to impose himself over others, and in doing so reflects how he has an egocentric superior view of himself. So, the analysis and evaluation of the translation between the beginning of the book and film versions of The Girl on the Train. From looking at the beginning of the book and the beginning of the film versions of The Girl on the Train, it's clear that some things have translated the same. To some extent this is true, as in both versions Rachel is preoccupied with other people and their perceptions of her. This is evident as in both versions Rachel refers to her ex-husband Tom and how he used to say that she had an overactive imagination. Paula Hawkins, the author, will have had Rachel mention this early on in order to effectively establish how Rachel lacks self-esteem, as the fact that she is thinking of how someone thought of her in the past shows how deeply rooted and impactful others' opinions of her are. Furthermore, the screenwriter Erin Cressida Wilson may have chosen to keep this segment as it contributes in regards to how the plot develops, that being with Rachel's low self-esteem being a key factor in her drunken outbursts and spiraling behaviour. Therefore, the screenwriter will have chosen to replicate the book in having Rachel be clearly self-conscious and low in self-belief. As in the book, it was an effective basis to stem her future actions and the narrative itself from. Therefore, by replicating already effective aspects of the book, the screenwriter will have expected to implement the same effectiveness within the film version. However, to some extent, not all things translated the same. This is as Megan and Scott are introduced at the beginning of the film, when in the book they are introduced later on. This is due to the film having a condensed length compared to the book, as the film is 112 minutes long, and the book can be read in roughly 10 hours total. Films are therefore much shorter than books, and in this case, due to the film being an adaptation of a book, the screenwriter will have been challenged to fit all of the most crucial aspects from the book into the condensed film time. Therefore, by introducing key characters as soon as possible, the screenwriter will have effectively been able to get the narrative moving, when in comparison to the book, the author had much more time to add depth in different areas. Furthermore, the screenwriter will have wanted to keep the audience engaged by getting them intrigued right off the bat. In introducing Megan and Scott early on, she effectively achieved this, as the audience will have been left wondering why Rachel had been so fascinated with them for about a year, and why Megan was so important to her. Therefore, to some extent, it is true that not everything translated the same from the book to the film adaptation of The Girl on the Train due to the smaller time frame filmmakers have to work with. This need to then condense the story led the screenwriter Erin Cressida Wilson to introduce key characters early, which would effectively keep the viewer engaged by leaving them asking themselves questions related to the narrative. Therefore, the screenwriter may have effectively navigated around the issue of a condensed film time by utilising the early introduction of characters. Furthermore, another way of which the translation of the film from the book is different at the beginning is the fact that the setting has changed, as the book was set in London, whereas the film is set in the outskirts of New York City. This is effectively a significant difference, as it adds to the dreary, bleak tones that are intended in the film. As the screenwriter says, it's much more of a drinking culture in England. It's not as shameful as it is here in America. Drinking at bars is all about going into a dark hole where nobody can see you do a bad thing. Therefore, another reason that some things translated differently is due to the more visceral and shameful undertones that relate to American drinking culture, of which this change in location would have effectively allowed the dark, shameful undertones to be projected to the audience, as a more widely accepted and much celebrated English drinking culture may have made it difficult to visualise the shameful connotations of such on screen. In conclusion, in the adaptation of the book into a film, it's clear that some things changed while some things stayed the same. This is as some of Rachel's monologue was kept the same as it performed its functions effectively in the book, and was easily transferable for the screenwriter to use it in the film. Therefore, the screenwriter did so and managed to effectively establish Rachel's poor self-esteem. Furthermore, a change in introducing some key characters much earlier in the film adaptation occurred due to the format of the film itself having a much smaller time frame to tell the story within. The screenwriter effectively took advantage of this by utilising the early introduction of the characters to engage the audience through the questions that they would be left asking. Furthermore, it is true that by having the location changed, this allowed the film team to portray the required darker tones more effectively than what would be possible if they had not changed locations. Therefore, it is true that in regards to the beginning of The Girl on the Train, some things changed and some things stayed the same with the film adaptation, due to the filmmakers' need to effectively portray certain themes and tones whilst keeping the audience engaged. So an evaluation and analysis of the key differences between the film and the written text. Yeah, to some extent, having Rachel go from drinking pre-mixed cans of gin and tonic in the book to drinking vodka in the film was an effective change to make. This is as due to the location changing from London to New York, it was necessary for the screenwriter to change Rachel's choice of drink, as although pre-mixed cans of gin and tonic are widely available in the UK, they are not available to buy in New York. Therefore, for the film to be contextually correct, it was important for Rachel to be drinking alcohol that could realistically be drunken by a real-life alcoholic resident of New York. Furthermore, this change will have helped add an extra layer of realism, which in turn will have kept the viewer engaged, as many American audience members may have seen alcoholics drinking in public, and therefore by seeing this in the film, they may be able to relate to the narrative more closely, and as well be keen to see the path that Rachel's character takes. Therefore, to some extent, this change was effective, as its impact was that it added contextual realism that audience members could have related to, and therefore become more engaged in the narrative. However, to some extent, this change may not be particularly effective in engaging audience members, as by having Rachel drink such a strong alcoholic drink as vodka, this gives off more hopeless and bleak connotations than if she were to be drinking some fruit cider, for example, which would connote a more health-conscious social lifestyle due to the lower alcohol volume. Therefore, audience members may feel less inclined to be engaged with Rachel in the narrative if they are disgusted by her choice of drink and the connotations surrounding it. Furthermore, if when the screenwriter was making the change she opted to have Rachel drink a more upbeat and less depressing drink, like the example of fruit cider, the audience may have felt more attracted to the character of Rachel and therefore be more engaged in her and the narrative surrounding her. Another difference between the book and the film is that Scott Hipwell was portrayed as less abusive in the film. This is evident as it is clear in the latter half of the book that he's not only emotionally but also physically abusive, as after finding out that Rachel is not an acquaintance of Megan, he locks her in a room and threatens to break her neck. Whereas in the film, this scene shows no violence or threats, but a great deal of tension still remains. To some extent, this was an effective change to make, as by having Scott's volatility lowered on the screen, it gives Tom the audience's attention more, which is especially impactful once his true evil self is revealed. This is as by lowering Scott's presence in favour of Tom, the audience is exposed more to the shocking effects of Tom's actions, that being as he murdered Megan. Therefore, the screenwriter may have made Scott less volatile so that later on in the film, when it comes to the audience being shocked by a character's actions, the focus is more on Tom. Furthermore, at this point it solidifies to the reader who the true villain of the story is, as if Scott was portrayed as violent, this may have caused confusion and could have potentially misled the reader as to who the true villain was. True villain was. However, to some extent, this may not have been an effective change to make, as if Scott had aggressively locked Rachel in a room on screen. This may have further added to the suspense of the film, as the audience may be left wondering if Scott is willing to go that far, how much further would he go? Could he have killed Megan? Therefore, the way in which the scene was changed from how it was in the book may have been ineffective, as if it had remained the same, it could have further added to the suspense and mystery of Megan's death. In conclusion, the decision to change Rachel's choice of drink was an effective one, as it added an extra layer of realism, which allowed audience members to relate to and therefore become more engaged in the story. Furthermore, the change allowed the screenwriter to intentionally project the bleak tones surrounding Rachel's lifestyle, as vodka supplied fitting connotations that effectively helped reinforce the atmosphere that the screenwriter was going for. Moving along, the change of having Scott be portrayed as less volatile was not an effective one, as it has had the bit in which he threatens Rachel and locks her away been replicated on screen. It would have added to the suspense of the narrative, as the audience would be influenced to think that he could well have killed Megan. Had this been done this way, Tom's reveal to be the killer could have been pulled off in a more engaging, twisting way, as the audience would be blindsided by the red herring of Scott. Alright, moving on. So, conclusions. To conclude, this PowerPoint presentation has provided multiple different arguments for and against, as well as an analysis based on the book and film versions of The Girl on the Train. It is my hope that you, if you have not already, you will read the book and watch the film, compare and contrast, and develop perspectives of your own related to the story and the characters involved. This has been written and presented by myself, Daniel Spencer. There's references and appendices there if you want to have a read. Thank you very much for listening.